Good times and great music at 2NURFM 103.7 as we have a look at some of the things that are happening in the world of science. And boy, are we covering some ground in terms of a timeline today. Professor John O'Connor out of the University of Newcastle is here. And John, we're wanting to sort of, in a way, dig around in the graveyard this morning.
That's right. This follows on from our discussion about Stonehenge and how burial told an important story. And so do the bones that are left behind of around Stonehenge and elsewhere. And it comes down to a couple of things. One is isotopes. Now, I'll explain what an isotope is. If you get an atom like hydrogen, it can be a simple proton and electron. But equally, if the nucleus is a proton plus a neutron, it's still hydrogen, just a little bit heavier. It still has an electron. And that doesn't change it chemically, but it does change it physically. So it's a slightly heavier atom. Carbon, there are various isotopes of carbon. Carbon-12, which is the most common one. Almost everything's made of carbon-12. But carbon-13, carbon-14, people have probably heard about carbon-14 dating.
Yes.
And so in the case of carbon-14 dating, that's produced all the time in the upper atmosphere by cosmic rays, gets absorbed into the vegetation, into everything around us, gets into our bodies, gets into the plants, and that keeps getting renewed. So it's at the concentration of the outside world. When we die or the plant dies, it stops exchanging it. And this radioactive carbon has always been decaying, but it doesn't get renewed. So it gradually decays off compared to the carbon-12. And how much it's decayed off can tell you how long ago since it died. And so that's probably the first thing you do with a skeleton. You do a measurement of the carbon-12 compared to the carbon-14 relative to carbon-12, and that'll say, it's 1,000 years old, 5,000 years old, whatever. They can do it quite accurately these days. But carbon's not the only one. Where you live, there are lots of elements which are lying around in various concentrations. Strontium and lead are two of them. We know about lead as a heavy metal. If you are in an area where there's a lot of lead or strontium, it'll get into your diet through the plants that absorb it and comes into your system. And surprisingly, you can locate people quite accurately where they've lived on the basis of these elements, strontium and lead.
So I wonder if people sort of, let's say you've lived somewhere where there's a lot of certain types of elements, and then you've spent a lot of time elsewhere, what sort of a picture could that potentially?
Well, then we bring into action the process of our body. So our body, as we grow up, we different parts of our body get rejuvenated at different rates. So, for instance, when you're young, you get your adult teeth. That's locked in. Those teeth don't grow anymore. They've locked in the concentration of those things you've been exposed to at that age. Say under 6, for instance. In the case of your bones, your femur, your big solid leg bones, they get replaced about every 15 years.
We don't think of that too often, do we?
Don't. And
bones,
basically,
particularly.
It's sort of breaking down and rebuilding and so forth. It's a constant reconstruction process. So that tells you what's happened in the last 15 years of your life. But ribs are much more mobile. I mean, they get replaced every couple of years. And so if we go back and look at the grave of the Amesbury archer, actually he was found just a few kilometres from Stonehenge, they could work out from so Stonehenge, middle of England, classic middle of England. This Amesbury archer grew up in Austria. So 2,300 BC, over 4,000 years ago, he moved from Austria, which is where he was born, across to Stonehenge. He obviously became very important there because he had a very important grave. But there's a case where the teeth tell you where he came from. Now, that was 2,300 BC, comes from the carbon-14, but the place he was born in came from the strontium and lead, and not only their existence, but the isotopes. And something special about Austria in terms of these occurrences, because Ötzi, the Iceman, the man found in the Alps, he from his bones, both his ribs and his femur and his teeth, they could tell that he spent his life either on one side of the Alps or the other at different stages of his life. So he's moving backwards and forwards over the Alps. But probably the greatest tour de force for this was Richard III's skeleton. This is the king whose body was found under a car park. Yes.
Made a movie about that about a year ago, yeah.
Did they? Okay.
Yeah.
of course, they know a lot about his life, but they can actually tell some things about that aren't written down. So, for instance, from his teeth, they could work out that as he grew up, his diet changed. Between the ages of about 4 and 6, they could identify a diet change which occurred when his family moved to Ludlow Castle, and he had less meat and fish at that stage of his life. Later in life, from his femur, you could see that the last 10 or 15 years of his life, it talked about his lifestyle and the sort of food he ate. But the most important thing is that was different to his ribs, which basically, as I said, was the last 2 years, the years when he was king. So, became king, he lived like a king.
Yeah, all of a sudden, the top-class meat and fish and everything else is coming back.
Yeah, he had more luxurious foods like wild fowl, freshwater fish, wine. And in fact, there's an evidence that the wine that he had came from the southern part of England. So this guy's history is written in his bones, very, very definitely. And these isotopes and these chemicals, and strontium is a classic example because it acts like carbon. It has a very similar chemical property to carbon, so it gets absorbed into the bones. There's no carbon, calcium. So it gets absorbed into the bones just the way a calcium does. But the carbon itself, you can, from its isotopes, actually work out what sort of plant diet they had. Not only can you work out plant or fish or whatever, you can work out whether the person or the animal was mainly a marine fish eater or a land meat eater or fish eater. But with the carbon, you can tell whether they were mainly eating a diet which involved what's called C3 carbon. That's rice, wheat, oats, barley, peanuts, tobacco, sugar beets, soya beans, spinach, or maize, sugarcane, pearl millet or sorghum. So you can actually identify you can fine-tune down to that level the sort of diet people were having back in the past. So it's no wonder when you see these shows with the archaeologists there going, that we can work this out, you go, how the hell can they tell that from a bone?
There's one of the big reasons why.
This is where they get it all, from the isotopes and elements in the bones.
John, who knows what things are going to be like in this space in the future? I think they're getting a bit too clever, so I'll be cremated so all the evidence goes with when I do.
I'll try and grab a rib and just see what that tells me.
I won't need it anymore. John, always a pleasure. We'll talk to you next time around.
Thanks, Mark.
A Professor of Science from the University of Newcastle, John O'Connor, right here on 2NURFM 103.7. Good morning.
A broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.